All right, you beautiful humans. I wanted to share a personal experience I had with penny stocks and even tell you about a loss, which can certainly often be the case for some of you who certainly haven't researched that particular stock. But I also want to share a pretty big win that I had with one. And although this wasn't a day trade situation, this was time and patience. I did hold for quite a while to get the six-figure return that I did. Now, for those that may need a little context, and of course, please do your own research from a licensed financial advisor. And timestamps will be throughout in case you don't have to, you don't need that context. But these penny stocks are essentially securities that are trading under $5 as they kind of are listed online. And often you're literally seeing these being traded for pennies. And I really categorize them as those that are trading under $1. And of course, on that note, I want to clarify that many of these stocks aren't on a major stock exchange like the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And so most often you're going to find them starting on over-the-counter exchanges by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority as it's listed. And there are statements about minimum requirements to be met and some transparency that needs to happen with the financials of the company. However, in your research, you may find securities that are being traded on other boards or exchanges that are not meeting these requirements without that transparency. So this will likely be a very big red flag for you, as it should be, because unless you're willing to lose money or really have money to lose, because it really can start to feel like you're gambling, and in some cases with very poor odds of a good return. And of course, I don't want to lump all companies and securities into the same, because there are some legitimate companies trading on this exchange that have a much higher valuation, and these aren't penny stocks, but they're on these exchanges because it's more convenient for them as an international business that have no interest in preparing twice as much paperwork to meet the SEC guidelines in the US. So I don't want to get too deep into this, really into the weeds here. So really, let's actually talk about the two penny stocks that I purchased that weren't for the purposes of day trading, as that's really a hot topic these days, but rather a much more lower point of entry in hoping for either a product or a service to really take off, or even an acquisition to occur. And first, I do want to say that I did do a little research into companies that were offering up alternatives. So this would be the first stock that I purchased. And I was looking at alternatives to the iPod. And so some context for you, this was back in 2006 when there were some actual players in the space trying to find some footing and seeing if they could put a dent in Apple. And of course, this also predates the first iPhone launch. So that's an additional piece of context for you. But one of the areas I was most intrigued with was the fact that due to the growing number of consumers streaming content, specifically music, this was really putting a serious strain on CD and album stores at the time. And there was a company called Clegg that had released an MP3 player that, to me, it really did look compelling as a device that had a really small footprint. And there was also a partnership with Tower Records to have these available in their stores. So as much as the writing on the wall seemed to be for these record stores, especially as we know right now what happened, I did feel like Tower was really trying to make a pivot here. And as we all know, that this space has since been consolidated so many times over. And although my last follow-up of this company, it does seem that it still exists, but my initial investment of $1,200 for 2,000 shares at 60 cents a share, it ended up going through a reverse stock split. And I am sure the company was really just trying to strengthen the optics on the valuation. So I ended up owning 500 shares, which had already fallen in value, and I couldn't even really trade these at the time because these OTC exchanges aren't really as hopping as the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, where there's a lot of volume happening, and specifically in these particular penny stocks. So I held on until eventually the shares just became worthless, and I really was unable to trade that security. So it certainly was a very humbling lesson that I am sure most would feel pretty completely deflated by. But there was actually a reason that it was stinging a little bit less, and that I had made another investment around the same time in a company that I had some relevant experience with, and this was in the healthcare space. And at the time, there was this write-up in a magazine about a company, Repro Med Systems. And this, of course, was before the proliferation of stock Reddit forums, and that many of you have probably lurked in to find any kind of stock that might pop. And honestly, at this time, this was really just more of an analog way of a pump and dump move, where some of these companies may be featured or a group of interested parties, let's say, would take out an ad and with a few of these stocks in that they thought were going to be hot picks. And so I did do my research and I looked through the fundamentals as well as what patents they may have held and any upcoming FDA approvals for their in-home infusion kits. As I really knew as a healthcare provider that the future of providing healthcare services was moving to a more remote and virtual path of delivery. However, I also knew that their target audience at the time was still a very small subset of patients, but that it really could potentially move into a variety of diagnoses if they were approved to do so. And of course, one quick glaring example would be a drug sildenafil that I would like to give you an example just as a comparison. When I had taken a job in a surgical ICU when I first started my career, I remember going through some additional training and learning about the meds that we were giving patients for pulmonary hypertension. And sildenafil was coming up as a treatment. And I remember thinking to myself, wait, isn't this? It is. It was approved for a different use, and you can imagine that in that use case, there was quite a few more patients out there with that diagnosis than pulmonary hypertension. And so this discovery resulted in a much higher cash flow and stock price because, hey, sex sells. But I didn't really consider that I would experience a similar level of success in no way, shape, or form, but I was banking on a longer-term upswing in their fundamentals and was willing to just hang out with my 10,000 shares that I purchased at 14 cents a share. And of course, over the years, I had noticed that it may drop by a penny or two here or there, but then there were times where I just leave it alone and come back to find it like at 38 cents, which was more than double my initial investment, but I did still hold on. And of course, speaking of holding on, I will fast forward here a bit just to kind of save you, getting into the story here to share that the company continued on and eventually started looking for leadership that seemed to be getting really kind of grooming it for either an acquisition or at the very least some rebranding and a direction to get into more markets, which it actually did rebrand to Koru Medical Systems, and it was even able to meet criteria to eventually be transferred and started trading on the NASDAQ. And of course, during this time, I noticed that my initial $1,400 investment had started to result in a $10,000, then $20,000, and then a $30,000 unrealized gain at the time. And I honestly wasn't sure I would see numbers like this. I mean, I was hopeful, but it was just amazing to see it on the screen. And if anyone remembers, and I'm sure many of us do, what was going on in the first quarter of 2020 as the pandemic was hitting, the markets were just really wild. And even though that transition over to the NASDAQ, I still had those 10,000 shares. So nothing changed. I still owned the 10,000 shares, but seeing that price move up to $6 a share, then to $7, and then to $8. And I just knew at this point, this was getting absurd because the fundamentals were decent, but it really wasn't based on any kind of fundamental because I ended up going on some stock trading sites where I could see the forums going wild over this thing and really pumping this stock. And at that point, I could see that this thing was eventually going to go back down to somewhere maybe around $3 or $4. And even if it did, I was still up quite a lot. So when I was going to make the trade, I decided I was just going to go ahead and sell all of my holdings when that occurred. So I ended up selling at $10.16. And that wasn't even the highest it was at, but I was already at such a massive return. And I was planning to take that particular investment and put that towards some debt and of course some real estate, which I ended up doing. And of course, this honestly just came down to timing and patience sprinkled in with some luck since I hadn't been following this as a daily trade. And even though it reached like a high of just under $12, but has since, as I checked it recently, it has since settled down to around $3. And of course, so at the time of me selling it at that kind of high, it probably was a lot of luck. And I certainly had enough of these shares that I could have taken some profits, watch the stock drop, and then buy back in as it went up, and then rinse and repeat. But this gain for me was a much larger return on the stock because, like many out there during the pandemic, this outlook was uncertain. And as a business owner, I was already looking for ways to consolidate expenses, which also spilled into our personal expenses. And we went into the remainder of 2020 with zero revolving debt and zero interest payments except for our mortgage. So would I actually do it again? Maybe I already did. But here's the thing, definitely do your research on any investment that you're going to be making and have a licensed professional be the one to tell you that these types of investments do carry a massive amount of risk, and the chances of being the bag holder on those pump and dump schemes, it's actually pretty high. Of course, I'll continue to share my investment journey with non-penny stocks as I have many of those in my portfolio. So stay tuned for more content like this, career advancement, business, and real estate. Find me here in the comment section below or over on Twitter. I am sending you all my very best, and I'll catch you right back here on the next one.